Good morning, everybody. That's wonderful for this early on a Sunday. My name is Arthur Levine, and this session is called Against the Odds. And for me, it's a real privilege to be here because I get to introduce some extraordinary people, including the person I regard as the premier reporter in American education, Claudio Sanchez. And who's the audience? 4 rows back. Claudio's NPR's education correspondent. He's a former elementary and middle school teacher. He focuses on the 3 Ps in education reform: politics, policy, and pedagogy. His reports, as you all know, they're in NPR's All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Weekend Edition. He has been working in public radio since the 1980s when he was 12 years old. He was a contributor to NPR News and a public affairs director at KXCR in El Paso. He served a year as executive producer of the Latin American News Service, covering Latin America and the U.S.-Mexican relationship. He joined NPR in 1989. He's got a slew of awards. He's got a 1985 Alfred DuPont Award. He's won the Martinez Marquez Award for the Best El Paso Press. He's won it for investigative reporting. He's received the Corporation for Public Broadcasting Award. He's a Nieman Fellow. He's originally from Nogales. He's a grad of Northern Arizona, and he did postgraduate work at the University of Arizona. And you know something? Those are all wonderful credentials, but he has a lot more going for him. We just figured out I've known him for 15 years. He is passionate. He is informed, and he's forthright on issues of education reform. He knows the area. He knows policy. He knows practice. He's also been one of those people. The education beat is not one that people stay on for a career. It tends to be a short-term job. They move on. He's made this his career, and we ought to be grateful that he has, because he's been in the classroom. He knows the immigrant experience. He understands what it means to have education and how it enhances or how it makes possible social mobility, how it gives kids a future. And today, he's going to interview 3 people. And those people are all participants in All Stars. And I need to do a blurb. There will be another session with these students next door at 12:25. It's going to be on the topic of the subjectivity of poverty. This group will be joined by a panel of renowned experts. And I think you will find that gathering almost as interesting as this one. Okay, let me introduce the other panelists. Immediately to Claudio's left is Ioana Allen. She grew up in Oakland. She's been a participant and a volunteer in All Stars for 11 years. She's a graduate of Cal State Hayward and will be graduating from JFK Law School shortly. Then we have Malaysia Sanders. And she's a student at City College of San Francisco. She's also been a participant in the Leadership Institutes. And she's been working a lot on tobacco use reduction. And she's been a youth advocate in that area. And now she's working with the San Francisco Board of Supervisors to try to introduce new legislation that's going to try to reduce the number and density of stores selling tobacco. She is a graduate of Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco. Zechariah Mays at the far end. He's a grad of the All-Stars Project in Developing Schools for Youth Leadership and their training program. He's an ongoing volunteer. He lives in San Francisco, and he's at the College of San Mateo. And the course he's taking in sociology sounds fascinating. With all of that said, let me turn over this session to Claudio Sanchez. We're going to do this in two parts. Claudio's going to talk with the All-Stars, and then I'm going to ask Claudio some questions. He's been covering our field for a long time. Let's ask him the questions about being a reporter, and let's ask him how you cover education and what the issues are from the perspective of the press. Okay? Claudio Sanchez.
Thanks, Arthur. It is a privilege to be here and to be able to speak to so many of you who know the issues as well as anyone. And so it was a stroke of brilliance when we thought of actually inviting young people who can kind of, as they say, put meats on the bones of your research. Not that that's a bad or a good thing. The good thing is that young people need to speak and speak to the truth about their education. So the idea here is to not so much interview them, but to have a conversation with them. And by the way, towards the end of this, we're going to allow for some Q&A. So think about the kinds of questions you would want to ask of any of us, especially the young people here. Here's the question, and I was telling them before we met that I wanted them to tell the most compelling moment in their lives until now, the most powerful moment when something called transformation kicked in, when they began to see the world in different ways than they had before. Who was responsible for that? Did they just wake up one morning and say, I want to go to college, I want to go to law school? Or was that a process that perhaps, as you all know, has become so difficult in this day and age for young people? So I'm going to go down the road here, down the line, and ask first you, Joanna. You're in law school. Tell me where you were 10 years ago. What were you thinking? What were you doing? Did you think you'd be in law school? You can go ahead and answer with the mic there.
As Claudio said, my name is Joanna Allen. I am 27 years old. I grew up poor in West Oakland. I am the youngest of 7 children. My mother was a poor homeowner in Oakland. Being a poor homeowner, she had to go to court and represent herself in court. She had to fight cases, she had to appeal cases, and we couldn't afford homeowners insurance. When I turned 16, the same house that my mother was fighting for so very eagerly in court, it burned down to the ground. And that meant me and my family became homeless. And it meant that I spent my senior and junior year in high school being homeless. I had to go to school early and to have light to do my homework. I had to take my baths in the back of our local church. We had to stay with friends. We had to stay with family. And I had to take food from school to my mother in order for her to be able to eat. This tragedy in my life kept me very motivated to reach my goals. My grades went from a 2.50 GPA to a 3.88 GPA. Then I met the All-Stars Project, and the All-Stars Project gave me a place to go and to learn about radical acceptance and learn about poverty and learn about being poor. And after watching my mother in court for so many years, year after year, just fight on her own with no help from any type of attorney, I decided I was going to go to law school. So concurrently with high school, I went to junior college, and by the time I was 17, I graduated from high school. When I was 18, I graduated from Merritt College, and I had a paralegal certificate. After that, I have an AA in liberal arts from Laney College. Then I moved on to Cal State East Bay, and I have a BA in political science. And now I'm in law school working towards my goal of becoming a lawyer, and I will graduate in May of this year.
Joanna, before you hand that off, you said your circumstances keep you motivated. But really the question is, why? How could anyone under those circumstances say, Tomorrow's going to be a better day. My life is not going to be this way forever. Because the kinds of kids that I talk to sometimes say, there's no hope for me. I'm a throwaway. That's the way people talk to me. People don't really care whether I do well in school or not. So why should I? When you say you were motivated, be more specific. What kept you going?
What kept me going was the simple fact that I watched my mother year after year fight for herself in court when she had nobody there to help her. She had no attorney that she could afford to come in there and who was educated enough to represent her rights and represent what she wanted to happen. And my mother was also a strong woman, so I also looked up to her and her strength that she had to keep going year after year and to do all that and to defend her family and to defend what she believed was right. So that kept me motivated.
How is she doing now?
Oh, she's doing good. She's doing good now. She takes care of my daughter and my nieces and nephews. Yeah, she's doing good.
Malaysia, tell us your story.
Hello, I'm Malaysia Sanders. I am 19 years old. I will turn 20 in the summer. And
I'm sorry, can everybody hear back there? Maybe just a little louder.
Okay, I apologize. Hi, my name is Malaysia Sanders. I'm 19 years old, and she lets me want to name my hero. My hero is my dad. My dad was the only parent working in my household, and he was supporting his 6 kids, and at times my mother's additional 2 kids who are older than his kids. So it was 8 kids that he was supporting. He had a city job, so they would say he makes good money, but that wasn't really the issue. We lived in San Francisco. I'm originally from San Francisco, and but we had to move out of the city just so we can afford to live. And the elementary school that I went to was Malcolm X Academy. It was a school in the middle of the Bayview Hunters Point area here in the city, which is a low-income neighborhood. And that school was actually going to close while I was going there, but Mayor Gavin Newsom kept it open, so I was able to continue my education there. But I want to highlight how high school really made me continue my education. In high school, I didn't have the best grades, and there were programs there in my high school that led me to want to stay in school. There was a program called the Teachers Academy, and it was leaning more towards my career goal. I want to become a future educator, preferably in elementary school. I want to teach kids the values of life before they go out there and try to mess up their lives, if they mess up their lives. I want to prevent it from happening. The Teachers Academy gave me the opportunity to visit the schools, volunteer at the schools, and watching my dad, continue to support us while we're in school, it really motivated me to stay in school as well. The Teachers Academy also let me go to City College at a young age. So I was a concurrent student at City College earning credits in child development. My major is child development. And now I'm at City College still working towards getting my child development degree. And man, when I was in school, it was hard for me to eat. I couldn't eat the cafeteria food. I didn't really pack lunches. I didn't have the money to buy food day to day, so I was really, really hungry in school. My grades showed for it. It took me a long time to get to school. It was commute after commute after commute every day. It was really, really hard. But now I strive to become a teacher so kids can have the opportunity that I had.
Before you pass that on to Zacharias, you use the word strive. There's a lot of research out there about strivers. And I remember talking to folks who felt that there's something about kids who face these kinds of odds, these kinds of circumstances, that makes them stronger, not weaker. And that's this generation of strivers who overcome incredible things. One thing that I thought was interesting about Malaysia when I read her bio was that your mom smokes.
Yes.
And you were telling me that you latched on to a program to stop the city from putting so many or making cigarettes so accessible. Tell us about that.
Well, we're known as the TURF team, which stands for Tobacco Use Reduction Force, and so we work to limit the amount of tobacco permits that can be distributed in the city, preferably in low-income neighborhoods because that's where they're mostly targeted, whereas like high numbers of youth, people of color, and people of low income, there are over 1,000 tobacco retail outlets in the city of San Francisco, most of them being in low-income neighborhoods. And so our goal is to reduce that number. So the less access that there is, the less that youth and people of low income and people of color will have the chance to smoke and die of like cancer and stuff.
And the reason I ask you that is because we were talking about motivation. There are things that kids latch on to that say, this is important to me, either because your mom smokes, or you see the bigger picture here of the health issue, especially in poor, low-income neighborhoods. But do you think you're getting anywhere with what you're doing? I mean, there are people who've been fighting this thing for a long time. What makes you think that you're going to make a difference?
Well, recently we've been having a couple of meetings with the city supervisors here in San Francisco. We've met with Supervisor David Chu, Supervisor Eric Marr, Supervisor Avalos, and a couple of the supervisors' aides, and they all seem very interested in this policy that we're trying to pass. We also talked to the San Francisco Health Commission, and they were all in favor of our policy. So just because of the support that they're giving us, I feel that we're going to be successful in this campaign.
Let's move on to Zacharias.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Zechariah. I'm 19. I currently live in San Mateo, not San Francisco. I'm number 7 of 10 children. The first to graduate middle school and the second to graduate high school. Now, my story starts off in Sacramento, where my family lived together, 10 children, my parents. And I guess you could say I was born into a little bit of chaos. I was born into the time when my parents started to disagree, I guess you could say. So shortly, well, it must have been 3 or 4, they separated. They were doing the 3 days, the 3 weeks thing, and our house burned down. So after that, my mother took about 6 of the kids, 6 or 7, including me, and we didn't have a home. My dad went his separate way. Some of the older ones went on their own. But we moved around a lot. We didn't have a place to stay. We stayed at friends' house. Some of it didn't work out. We ended up moving somewhere else. Different government housing all over the Bay Area. We stayed in San Diego. My uncle owned a house. He let us stay there for a while. But I guess it kind of seemed like the norm for me. Like it was kind of normal, It was just like I said, I was born into it. So this is just how it was. My mom, she couldn't work. She was busy taking care of the 6 kids on her own. The child support thing, that wasn't working out. And so sometimes, she didn't have a job. She wasn't working. She was getting some assistance through the government. But sometimes we didn't have food. I thought it was normal to go to get your food from food drives. We would go to find food drives, different places we would go. We're waiting in line. Okay, yeah, this is just, this is what we do. This is how it goes. This is how we get food. And I remember sometimes when we couldn't find places like that wherever we were, we would be eating like canned food, and we would have to, limit what we eat because we had to stretch it out and make sure, so I'd be hungry sometimes at home. And so what I left out in the beginning was my parents had the idea that they would homeschool all 10 of their kids, which is a good idea, but it's a lot of work. And when the parents separated and the family fell apart, when we're moving constantly, there's no time to set up the homeschooling thing. So I was not doing school, my siblings either, that whole time. And so, let's see. Then I ended up moving out around, I was 14 or 13, to my grandmother's house in San Mateo. And I wasn't in school then for about a year or 2. And so you got to think, like, what is a kid that's not going to school? What is he doing all day? Well, a young teenager, a young mind like that can cause some havoc if he has free time on his hands like that. So I started getting brought home by the police. Started getting into a lot of trouble. You can find trouble anywhere, you know. And so my auntie, who was a big part of me going to school, I thought about school, but I mean, I knew I probably should be there, but I just wasn't, you know. And so my auntie, you know, she pulled me aside one day and she's like, hey, you need to be in school. You need to be going to school right now. She saw I was going down that path. One of the things she also did, I'm mentioning her because she was a big part of that change. She put me enrolled me in boxing, which took up a lot of time out of my day to keep me off of the street. All my friends, you know, they have records. They're or in jail, you know, and they're not doing so well right now. And it's because of her that I'm not in that pool, you know. So I began going to school in the 8th grade. I was been playing the catch-up game for a long time, and it hasn't been the easiest. And during high school, my grades really started dropping, and I have 2 younger brothers and a baby sister. And my younger brothers started living there with me, and I'm like, you know, I got to set an example for them. You know, I'm their older brother; they got to look up to me. But I wasn't doing good. I was doing horrible in school. And it really depressed me, and it got me down, and I'm just like, well, I kind of stopped caring. I'm like, what's the point? I'm not doing good. I'm not going to do good anyway. So, you know, my auntie was trying to push me and keep me going, but it was just tough. I was just having a hard time, like I said, playing the catch-up game the whole time. And then the All-Stars, that was a good program that I came in contact with. My former principal at a different school, she referred me to Dr. J, and I got in contact with the All-Stars. And what the All-Stars did for me, you know, when they take us to different businesses and teach us about, you know, the business world. And at that time, I was feeling like, you know, there's no point. Like, school, forget school. Nothing's going good for me right now. What's the point of it? And I kind of felt like didn't really have much purpose, honestly. And when I got to the All-Stars and I started going to those places, I was like, you know, maybe I can do stuff like this. You know, this must be the reason why you go to school. You know. And so, you know, being the All-Stars really gave me more motivation, you know, to keep going and not just dump school off to the side. And as I said, I'm the first to graduate middle school and the second to graduate high school. So that was a lot of pressure for me to deal with at the time. Let's see, I'm pretty sure I've gone.
I have a question for you,
Yeah,
actually.
what do you got?
I mean, it's interesting. You have a mom, a dad, an auntie, people who made a big difference on all of you. Mm-hmm. Had those people not been there, do you think you'd be here?
Not a chance. Realistically, honestly, I'd probably be in jail somewhere right now. Down the path that I was going to, you know, before I started going to school, hanging out with the wrong people, doing the wrong things. You know, I was going down that route. That, you know, it's real. You know, my friends are there right now, so I definitely would not be here right now, for sure.
What about you, Malaysia? You think you'd be here without your dad?
Well, the teachers that I encountered motivating me to go to school too. So even if I didn't have my dad, I feel like those teachers that I encountered would have motivated me still to be in school. So I'm grateful for my dad and my teachers.
Okay. What about you, Anna?
I feel the same way. I think that the strength and the advocacy of my mother definitely kept me going and kept me wanting to be who I am today.
Here's another question, and we'll start segueing here to Arthur, wanting to know more about how we report on these things. I'm really curious to know how you talk to young people, your mentors, your role models, whether you view yourselves as that or not. What do you say to someone who mirrors you, someone who reminds you of you? What do you say to them if you see them struggling, if you see them not caring about their school or their education, if you see them saying, my God, everything I have to deal with in my life is reason enough for me not to even want to go to college or to go to school? Anna, you first.
What I try to do is, or what I would continue to do when I'm talking to a young person, is try to remind them that there is a world outside of their current world, and that their situation that they're currently in is not going to last forever. And another thing is, I like to remind them that they don't have to really fit in with the in crowd. If they want to take their education slowly, I think they can take their education slowly. If it means going to a 2-year college first before you go to a 4-year university, I think they should do that. If it means maybe taking a trade course first, do the trade course first before you go on to bigger things as a university or something like that, so they won't get caught up in the 4-year university and then have to repeat and go back to a 2-year university.
I would encourage young people and youth to actually join a program where they feel that they're doing something. So find something that they love, and if they love it that much, to join a program that would help them continue with that path that they're trying to go down. I don't want them to fail, so the program is there to motivate you. It's there to provide resources, so those resources are there. So I tell them to find the resources, and you'll succeed.
But Malaysia, I have a question though. When you say you find something you love, how do you do that? How do you do that when you're hungry? How do you do that when you just don't want to go show up for school, let alone be interested in an after-school program or any other kind of program? How do you find a love, a passion for something if you're so busy just trying to survive?
Well, I say it like this. If they're more interested in video games than they are in school, then maybe try to find a program where they can teach you about the design of video games. If you're more interested in watching TV, try to find a place where you can try to act, things like that, things that you do daily. If you're hungry and you wish you can cook, join a program where you can find a place to cook, and maybe you'll fall in love with that. But
That's a good answer, yeah.
Something that you can find you love, then join a program that can help you get there.
Wow.
So the question was,
When you talk to young people, and you know, you've referred often here to friends of yours who are now in jail, who didn't take the path you did. If you see an 8th grader, a 9th grader, precisely on that path, what do you say to him or her?
well, it definitely depends on the individual. A lot of, I'll say my friends, a lot of them, when I talk to them about the program, let's say All Stars, when I talk to them about that, I mean, there's so many question marks, and they're embarrassed, they're nervous, they're like, I don't know if I want to get involved with something like that. Like,
why are they nervous? Why? What's embarrassing about it?
I don't think they don't feel like they can. They feel out of their element. They'll feel out of their environment, and a lot of kids are scared and to do that and be exposed, and that's a really big part of it. So they kind of how can I say this? Form kind of a form kind of a wall, and I try and tell them, like, hey, there are things out there, and like the All Stars, it really opened up my mind to what's out there. You know what I mean? And kids need to know what's out there, but if they're scared and too embarrassed to be exposed on where they're at in life, they're not going to do it. So one thing that really opened my eyes was I always had a lot of questions about poverty and if it's really true, like, because you hear people talk about it, and a lot of people don't even know they're in poverty. And like they'll compare themselves to another country, a third world country, but that's different. This is America, and it's poverty in America is poverty in America, and that's what we're dealing with.
That's a really profound idea, that you don't know you're poor, you don't know you live in poverty, and so you're oblivious to opportunity?
Yes. Like me. Like I thought, we go to the food drive and that's just how it is. No, that's not how it is. Wake up and smell the coffee.
Yeah. I'm pretty much out of questions, Arthur. If you want to pick up here where we left off, and unless you all have a final message here, you're still going to stay up here so that if people have questions, they'll ask you. I wanted to mention something that I thought was really funny. In a movie, and forget what you thought of the movie, you know, the politics of it. It was that movie Won't Back Down. It was about the creation of charter schools. But there's the protagonist at one point early in the movie where she says, this is the mom, and I thought of researchers, by the way, when I read this, heard this. I can't wait for 10,000 studies about how being poor affects education, but I can tell you being poor sucks, and my kid can't read. Your stories remind me, when I think of parents who fight for their kids, reminds me of this character. Because in the end, you know, your parents, in many ways, are your inspiration, or should be. And in many ways, even if they're not there for you because of a broken home, because they're just not there, because they don't have the time, it seems to me that that anchor that you have with family ultimately becomes a huge factor in how you motivate yourself and how you see the rest of the world. But let alone the fact that you all have been lucky in finding programs that help. Arthur?
Thank you. I'm going to ask this first. You guys have some questions for Claudio?
Wait a minute. That wasn't part of the plan. That wasn't.
Here, you can read this.
Okay. You actually have a question? Uh-oh.
Well, tell us a little bit about your beginning and how you got involved with this.
Arthur, Arthur was saying, we realized, you know, you actually have had siblings who've gone on to college before you did. So then Arthur and I looked at each other and realized we were the first ones in our families to go to college. My story is not terribly unlike yours. Growing up poor on the U.S.-Mexico border, my mother deciding to move to this country after my parents had separated, and my mother essentially saying, you know, life was much, much tougher on the American side, the U.S. side, than it was in Mexico, although she had fled from a situation where, you know, being a single mom in Mexico is not easy. It's not, you know, the problems, I think, are much, much more intense. And I remember she would always complain about walking down our street through a gauntlet of other adults, other people in the neighborhood who would just murmur, you know, boy, that woman, she has it tough. Her kids, no father. What's going to become of them? And she got tired of that. She got tired because my mother never wanted to be a victim. And so she moved us to this country, an older brother, who by then had stayed in Mexico. He was older and wanted to go to school there. And an older sister and a younger brother. And when we moved, you know, we moved into poor neighborhoods where everybody saw us more as a threat than as neighbors, because we were, you know, Mexicans trying to fit into the cheap market there, the cheap labor market, and we were going to take their jobs. And the border is a strange place in that sense, in that it's an economy that survives on cheap labor and on unfairness, even on the American side. My mother, I think for maybe 2 months, was on welfare. She hated it. And her message to us that she drilled every day was, your dignity is more important than anything else. Your dignity is going to help you survive. I don't care how tough you think things are. So never let anyone tell you that you are not deserving of a good education. Never let anyone say to you, maybe you can do well working at a shoe store versus pursuing a career. And then she would say, but if you're going to really pursue this idea, this notion, and build your life around this dignity, here's what you have to do. You have to dress well. You have to be clean. You have to speak clearly. You have to carry yourself with confidence. Now, these are all things that as a 10, 11, 12-year-old goes in one ear and out the other. But you know what the difference is, and I'm sure it happens to you, is that I saw her model it. I saw her defend herself against the odds. And that, more than anything else, was what made me think, why not? There's nothing that can get in the way of me making it beyond where I am now. I don't know if that's a... So, Arthur, let's talk about how these young people become stories on the radio. You want to stand up there? Sure. Yeah. Here you go. Use this one.
Well, you're going to need that.
I know, but I'll pass it back and forth.
I'll borrow that.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to start off with a softball question. You ready?
I like those.
How'd you end up being an education reporter, and why have you stuck with it?
I was this close to becoming my older brother's salesman. He sells auto parts in Ensenada, Mexico. And I had been teaching, I left journalism school, no jobs. Everybody wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. And so I went to Mexico City. I was a stringer there for UPS, which is no longer around. And I just couldn't make a living there. It was just too hard. Went back to Arizona and couldn't find a job there. I was freelancing, not writing about anything in particular. And then I saw a position for teaching. So I took a job as a teacher, K through 9. I taught English as a second language, Spanish as a second language. I taught photography. I taught writing. I was the soccer coach. I was the, I cooked on weekends because it was a boarding school. And I was the sponsor of the 4-H pig club. And I drove a van after school. And I had 8 kids under my care. These were, you'd sit around and these kids were either really, really poor or really, really rich. The really, really rich kids would sit around on weekends and look at People magazine and say, that's my dad, that's my future mom, that's my old mom. Now, these kids had never seen their parents other than maybe on a visit or two. They were sent from one place to the other. Oh, thank you.
That's great.
It's my wife, by the way.
Maria Teresa.
Yes. And I realized that teaching was something I couldn't see myself doing anything else. That first year I was there, I wanted to teach. I loved teaching. Second year, huge strike. All the teachers, the good teachers, leave. The school is in turmoil. I have no mentors. I'm pretty much useless at that point, and I say to myself, I'm going to do more damage than good if I stay. So I went back, and that's when I was almost, my brother was saying, look, if you want to make some money, come down and see me. And then there was a huge lawsuit at the University of Arizona, which at the time had no Spanish-speaking reporters, incredibly. A third of the town is Spanish-speaking. And this was a public radio station. And so they sue, and somebody calls me up and say, Claudio, you want a job? We're going to sue the university. I think you can get one. So yeah, the university hired 8 reporters. I was one of them. I didn't want to do television, so I stuck with radio. The magic thing about radio is that it's a medium that requires both great writing and gives you this incredible power of voice and sound and scenes. To see a quote written is one thing. To hear, as we've heard these young voices, to hear that voice and its texture and its delivery is an incredible, powerful thing. So to answer your question, I then began reporting out of the Southwest, mostly, smuggling, drugs, undocumented. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time in a way in that right around that time, in the mid-'80s, the whole Contra scandal was blowing up. There were thousands of Central American, mostly Guatemalans, Salvadoreños, Guatemaltecos, crossing the border, dying in the desert, the sanctuary movement of churches that were taking these folks in violation of U.S. immigration law had spread. And when I started reporting about that, NPR took notice. They needed someone in the Southwest. NPR had only one guy in Austin and somebody else in San Diego, nothing in between. And their coverage of the border, U.S.-Mexico relations, was nil. And it's improved a lot since then. And I always feel that it had been because not just me, but others like me in that region had come to their attention. And they hired me. Right before that, I was in El Paso covering the U.S.-Mexico border. I was a news director at a small radio station, KXCR, bilingual station.
Yeah.
So that's a softball question? Okay.
Why have you stuck with it?
Why did I what?
Why have you stuck with this beat? People do not stick with this beat.
I'll tell you, and I'll give you just a short answer. I wanted to cover immigration at NPR, and in a way, that's why they hired me. They said, okay, you've got a lot of experience covering the Mexican border. Yeah, you can do some immigration, but we need an education reporter. And I said, okay, sure, I can do a little bit of that. I'd not cover education on the border. When I got to NPR, though, I got a pretty decent travel budget. And when I did stories about schools, it was right around the time that we began to see this extraordinary demographic shift. So almost every school I went to, it didn't matter whether I was in New Jersey, in Miami, certainly Atlanta, the West Coast, the Midwest, I kept running into immigrant kids in these schools that were plopping down on these school systems. I remember being in Gainesville, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. And I remember doing a story about, now this is KKK country. I visited a compound of the KKK back then because they were running around intimidating and doing really terrible things at the Latino community that Purdue Chicken had brought in from all parts of Mexico. Cheap labor, mostly undocumented. But it was almost as if, you know, they had somehow lifted this little town out of Zacatecas, Mexico, and plopped it right down in this community. And the black and the white community were hostile, to say the least. Both. I remember arriving the day I did the story, there was this town meeting where both black and white folks, in order to clear the air about what was going on with the Latino communities, essentially sat down and said, here are the worst stereotypes of Mexicans that we know. And you name it, it was nasty. But yet there was an effort afoot to really reconcile the new immigrant community with the old South of black and white. And to me, it opened my eyes to the browning, as some have said, of America, to the age in which we are now, and its political as well as educational implications. But going back to your question, I stuck with it because I saw schools as a window to this nation's future. Every time I saw a story, I said, this is where this country is headed, and if we don't solve these problems, we're going to be in serious trouble. 20 years later, Arthur, I'm not so sure that we've solved very many problems. This nation is still in the dark ages when it comes to understanding the Latino immigrant community. It is still struggling to understand the role of language, building on a language to teach English, building on people's immigrant experience like this nation has always done, but to embrace this new community, because it's not going away. We know that. And yet, as Gary Orfield has pointed out so often, and so many researchers here, we have more failure to show for our last 2 decades than we do have successes. And I think that that is why I stick with it, because in the end, I think I see myself as an optimist, someone who can bring a story to the attention of folks and say, this is why this is important, and this is a voice you should listen to if you don't or haven't.
Okay, we're done with the softball questions. What are, your stories cover a great deal more than the Latino community. What are the key issues we're facing in education? What are the biggest policy issues we have to confront?
New poverty. The new poverty. That's the issue. And it's not because of race or ethnicity. The new poverty affects poor people. The new poverty that we're seeing today is a poverty of spirit, a poverty of not just monetary, not just material. It's a poverty of trust, where I think at a point where the little faith we have in our public schools has undermined the bigger, more noble idea that public schools have to be and have been for a long time the one institution that brought so many people from very different backgrounds together to create some semblance of civility, of understanding, of insight. Those institutions are disappearing every day. I have nothing against charter schools. I have nothing against private schools. But we're losing institutions that brought people together from such diverse backgrounds that we are now creating boutique schools that bring together that are more like-minded than they're not. And I think that the story of education, you know, it's interesting that we're having this event here talking about poverty and education almost on the eve or the 30th anniversary of Nation at Risk. I did a short piece before I came out here on the, based on this anniversary. And, you know, I realized, I mean, if you all recall the ominous language of that, of Nation at Risk, and I'm trying to look for it here because I wrote it down. It was, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might as well have viewed it as an act of war. We remember that. It's powerful. But, you know, in talking to folks about the anniversary, the one thing that stuck with me, and I was talking to maybe someone you all may remember as well, Ron Woke, founder of Education Week. I asked him, what was it about that report that made a difference or maybe fell short? And he said, Nation at Risk kind of viewed students of America as middle-class white kids who would really do well if they just tried harder and if we raised standards and got tougher on them. There was no recognition, though, that there was a terrible inequity out there, that was a dominant fact that was completely ignored in the report. And I couldn't agree with that more because it's the one problem we haven't solved. How to educate poor kids in this country. We've made extraordinary strides since 1983 in improving public schools. I don't think anyone denies that. But those schools for those kids are just not good enough. We know that as well. So the story of education in this country is a story, although I like, you know, Robert Samuelson, the columnist's take on this. He says that for all its flaws, American public education, the genius of American public education, is that it's a system of second, third, fourth, and fifth chances, which is what some of these young people speak to. This is a system unlike any other in the world in that if you bombed in high school, if you didn't finish 6th grade or 8th grade, there's an institution down the road called community college that offers you a second and a third chance. There are programs, there are institutions out there that say, we don't care what you did that you or you didn't do. We don't care that you're at this stage in your schooling or your education that hasn't worked. Try this. And for that, this nation has, as far as I'm concerned, has invented an institution called hope. And that hope is hopefully something that you can build on. You know, too much research, if I may piggyback on this, too much research out there is about the problems. Not enough research is about the aspirations and the hope that young people have. And that's an ongoing story.
I was wondering how long I'd have to wait. Let me ask this. You know, these are really hard times for us in the world of education. It seems like the press is filled with negative stories about schools, about teachers, about most aspects of our being. And I think we have a sense that we're being picked on right now. Is our perception correct? Is the criticism fair? And if the criticism is real, what do we do about it?
Perception is reality. You're right. The media, and this isn't just about coverage of education. The media sells newspapers, puts programs together because we concentrate on the negative. There have been experiments, people trying to do good news broadcasts that go nowhere. I think it's a matter of balance. And I think that it's a matter of insight. Reporters, as you pointed out, Arthur, come and go in education. Very few stay. So very few really learn the intricacies, the reasons, the complexities of education. They don't spend the time. I get my share of criticism for, putting on negative stories that maybe people feel are unfair about teachers, about teaching. You and I have done stories about the condition of colleges of education. You're embarked on an extraordinary project to change that. Does that mean we should focus exclusively on your efforts and not on those colleges of education that are just doing a horrible job? No, it's a matter of balance. My take on the stories that I do is that I always try to at least end up on an upbeat note. And I recall the story about computers in schools very early on. We had done a series. I'd gone to Columbus, Ohio, where Apple had created this super high school, wall-to-wall technology, just one high school. Well, the flip side was that it was the only one that they had invested in. And so you had all kinds of other schools out there saying, when are we going to get that? Well, I'm sorry, this costs too much for you. So it was really one big advertisement for Apple, making a huge intrusion into schools where there's tons of money. But I remember going to North Carolina, Orange County, not far from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Orange County is this huge, sprawling, mostly agricultural area. And I was visiting with a family, and the family didn't have a computer at home. We were talking about what it's like to have or not have the resources in your schools to even buy computers for adults, let alone kids. And I remember sitting down in the living room with this family, and we were talking about, well, here's why we can't afford one. And this little girl comes out and says, I have a computer. And she comes out and she shows me this, these little Toys R Us gadgets with hangmen. That was her computer. And I told the story, and the next day, someone in St. Louis, Missouri, who had listened to the story says, give me an address. I want to send that family a desktop computer, top of the line. That in and of itself does not motivate me to think that someone who listened is going to solve one kid's problem or one family's problem. What motivates me is that there are listeners out there that I envision, that I think, that want to do the right thing, that are inspired by people who they hear are in trouble and say, maybe there, but for the grace of God go I. Or say, I have so much. I have so much. It's time for me to give something. Or maybe these are people who've always thought that way and have always given something back. I want to find those in our listeners. And it's a roundabout way of me saying, if a reporter reports that way, if a reporter finds a scene, a voice, an individual in a story that then kickstarts something emotional in a listener or a reader, that's when we get at, I think, the real way to raise the quality of the reporting and to be more fair to educators and to education.
How do you pick your stories?
My editor picks about 10% of my stories. I pick the rest. Well, that's the result of being there 20 years. So what NPR has done, though, is begun to include a lot more of our correspondents out there to do more education stories. You know, I'm the only education reporter at NPR right now. For a while, I shared it with a colleague, Larry Abramson, who was doing a little bit more higher ed stuff. That was great. Now I'm doing everything all by myself, and when you're in Washington, you get swallowed up by all the stupid things that happen in Washington. You are forced to go to XYZ hearing to talk to people who don't know what they're talking about. You're drawn in by whatever the president is saying, what Secretary of Duncan is doing, and you end up, in my view, missing everything. Because the real story of education is in the trenches. It's in coast to coast. You know, DC has an interesting education story, but it's unusual. It's a strange place to do education stories. So thankfully, I have a budget that says, Claudio, go to Texas, talk to those people over there who had to deal with a corrupt superintendent who cheated kids out of their education. Go to Miami, talk to that family who's now interested in getting their kids to learn Chinese, Portuguese, Spanish, English, and French. Go to Chicago, talk to the teachers there who are up in arms about what they view as unfair, about how they've been treated. I mean, it's an opportunity to cover an enormous amount of ground. But the real secret, I think, to staying in this beat is, and to picking the right stories is not just to say, so what's trending out there? Or, you know, what are people Googling? I mean, we've now got all kinds of really young people running around NPR saying social media is really dictating this, and the other. Well, I don't MySpace, I don't Facebook, I don't text, I don't tweet, I don't do that stuff. I think that what it takes to really get to those really great stories is not to follow the crowd, not to follow the trend, to find those jewels of stories by doing what reporters have always done, being curious, calling up someone out of the blue and asking, what's going on in your district? You know, I once told my editor, although they didn't take me up on it, I thought it would have been a good idea, to put a big wall of a map of the United States on the wall, and for me to get a dart and to not face it, but throw it backwards and see where it landed, and go do a story about the place where it landed, a story about education. Because we're missing, for all the attention that all the big stories get, strikes and Common Core and, you know, and immigrant kids, and I swear there is a story out there that is amazing that I could find by throwing a dart at a map. And I'm still fighting for that. Trying to get, I'm sorry.
Just do it.
Oh, yeah. I won't tell my editor. Maybe I'll throw the dart at her. And
Okay, what's the story that you've always wanted to cover and never had a chance to do?
Reform in Latin America. I've only done one story about that in my whole career. Went down to Dominican Republic, where the education ministers of, I think, close to mostly South American, Central American, were meeting to talk about the same kids who we run into in this country. The story of migration from Latin America in this country is enormous. We cover it almost as if it's all about the border stopping people. But the immigrant community in this country has dictated how we deal with education. And if it hasn't yet, in somewhere like Casper, Wyoming, it will tomorrow and the next day and the next day. It's a transformative trend that is changing the face of our schools, the face of, certainly, of public education as we've known it. And yet, the irony is that it is not unlike the Greek, the Polish, the Italian, the Ethiopian, I mean, any group from any country that you can think of that has come to this country in stages, certainly at the turn of the last century, that transformed our education system. We're going through something as big, if not bigger, now. So the story I would love to know and understand is, how is it that these countries are exporting some of their most valuable resource, people? You know, Mexico's most valuable export is not oil. It is people. Because those people are the hardest working, are the most concerned about their kids' future because that's one reason they come here. And yet we do not take that into account. Forget about the legal versus illegal issue. They're here. And their story and their roots and what we can learn from those roots in terms of their educational experience is important to how we deal with it here. It's not a story that we are telling.
I have only a couple more questions, then we're going to turn it over to you. Okay? One is, as educators, we're living in a world, as is everybody else, of deep ideological divisions, declining revenues due to a recession, and a country going through a transformation from a national analog industrial economy to a global digital information economy. And this is a really hard environment for us to work in. And I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of guidance in terms of just tell us about the landscape and talk a bit about, let's pick one issue, an issue like the Common Core in that context.
Boy, we don't know anything about the Common Core, so I don't know what we can say. It's a mystery to me. It's a trend that, or it's a policy that's coming that 45 states and the District of Columbia have just adopted, but they're doing it in the blind. The one story that I've done, and we've got tons more that we have to do, was I was in Kansas, in Olathe, Kansas. That's where the boot got invented, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah, the Pony Express, they needed new shoes for riding across the country. Anyway, so in Olathe, a suburban school system, affluent, great school, great high school that I visited. This principal tells me, Common Core over my dead body. Why? Because we have a much higher standard than the Common Core pretends. Because we send 99% of our kids to college. Because we have science teachers, biology teachers, and chemistry teachers with their master's and doctorate degrees. Because we do not need the Common Core, let alone, we don't need the federal government telling us what to teach, when to teach, why to teach. Now,
he's from Olathe.
There's a lot of truth in that. Why should we be so quick to adopt what comes the closest to a national curriculum, to a national test that's coming down the pike? Given all the anxiety we have about the value of tests, how they're used. I think that we're putting the cart before the horse on this, and yet the people who have pushed this, David Coleman, one of the architects, now at the College Board, swears that this is going to fix everything. How he knows that, I do not know. It's going to fix everything we've worried about, getting our kids to compete with the Singapore kids, with the Korean kids, with the Chinese kids, everybody who's beating us. There's been this myth that American public education is now so bad that we've become we're becoming a third-rate economy, a third-rate nation. The people who say that is not just a myth, it is a disservice to the American public to scare people into buying something that they're going to, may or may not help. Now, let me flip the coin here in my conversation with that principal, because I reminded him, and I'd already looked some of this stuff up. Okay, fine, you're sending 99% of your students to a pretty decent college, community college, four-year college. And I said to him, 30% of those kids you're sending every year are taking remedial math and remedial reading. They don't know how to write. We were talking about this earlier. Kids don't know how to write. The question is, are those the skills that are still going to give them a shot at a living wage, at a good job? And I don't know the answer to that, because I was also admitting earlier on with these young people in the room that I don't know technology. I don't understand how it works, how it's supposed to make our lives easier. Now, I use it, I have to use it, I can't live without it. But when it comes to education, it's still a mystery to me. You know, there's a guy named Perlman who wrote a book called School's Out. Perlman said, if only we got rid of all the brick and mortar, stop spending money on that brick and mortar, and tether these kids to a gadget that allows them to learn anything, anywhere, anytime. Could be in a mall, could be at the park. Give poor people, like you would food stamps, give them a voucher to go to Best Buy and buy this technology. Man, it sounds so easy. It sounds so great. Do we really believe it? I don't think so. Not enough of us anyway. Not yet. I would be the first one, though, to admit technology is going to change the way kids, it already has, to change the way young people learn. All you have to do, if you've got kids, is look at them. I mean, on the airplane with some little boy 3 years old doing all the stuff on his, or your daughter who's about to go to college, listening to music, looking at an iPad, talking on the phone, watching TV and listening to the radio at the same time. The learning that is going on and how technology has literally, I think, I'm not a scientist, changed the brain is incredible. There is hope in using technology. Your question is, how do we fix the kind of job that educators K through 20 are doing? You keep at it. You don't give up. You create models. You experiment. You know, Ted Koldery, who is known as the godfather of charter schools, said to me, talking about Nation at Risk, he said, Nation at Risk was important, of course, but here's what hasn't happened in 30 years. Innovation, real innovation, breaking the mold of these institutions we call schools or colleges, reinventing ourselves. Well, what's the big story these days about higher ed? MOOCs. Not because it's a new education model, because it's a new business model that's going to undermine all those expensive Ivy League schools out there that charge an arm and a leg eventually when MOOCs get things right. Because it is going to attract young people who are comfortable with that kind of delivery of education. I'm not saying it's all good. All I'm saying is that this is change that has happened that is not, we're not going to go back. We're not going to turn the clock back anytime soon to build on the old education models. So my advice is, if you're an educator, if you're a researcher working at an institution, is think about that future that is every day incrementally becoming, changing, transforming what you do as a researcher, as an educator, as a teacher, as a president of an institution. Think about how that future is going to look like in a few years, because if you don't, it's going to overtake your thinking. And we will all be the worst of it because there's too much talent to waste. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. One last question, which is, why not end on a happy note and say, who are the most impressive leaders you've met?
You are the most impressive leaders.
Okay, now your
met.
questions. Who are the most impressive people you've met?
Well, you know, I was telling Arthur that I still have a Rolodex, and Arthur's really, I have under W, I've had 3 names for wise men and wise women of education. I've had Arthur there. He's been the longest. Arthur is an extraordinary man, an extraordinary resource for reporters, not for everyone, maybe, but for reporters. And I think that we need people who have had a history, a foot in the past, to be able to talk about the future, and who understand the need for that transformation to happen. I used to have Ted Sizer on that list. I've had people like Deborah Meyer on that list, and a guy named George, forgot his name now. He's a principal in Ohio. I've had people who I thought, it's not so much that they're good, that they're intelligent, that they're bright, that they've got enormously important ideas. It's their place and where they are that is valuable to me. I don't, and one thing I was reminded of, I get frustrated in talking to some very brilliant people in academia because often they don't speak English. They speak research. And it's very hard. I can't tell you how often I've done 45-minute interviews and I can't use it. And I call back and I say, can you say this? But then I end up writing it for them. And I don't think I want to do that. It's just a roundabout way of saying that I like to talk to people who are experienced and who are really, really smart, but who have a wealth of experience and know how to convey that to my audience, to the people I talk to on the radio. I mean, that is first and foremost, people who make sense, who can be lucid in their explanation of the problems we face, of the solutions out there. And one other person I've had is Bill Goldstone. I don't know if anybody of you know, he's Clinton's domestic policy advisor in his first term, who then got on his bad side for promoting other stuff that Mr. Clinton didn't want. Bill Goldstone, who I think last time I heard was with Brookings Institution, it's an extraordinary mind, but a very finely tuned message about what I've been talking about here, about opportunity, about education in America being that, you know, that cliche that we all think about, being the road that paves your way to success. And those kinds of people are not out there as much because we've gotten caught up in the ideological rhetoric of them versus us, rather than us, as Nation at Risk tried to suggest, working on this together. Thank you.
You were doing so well until your last answer. I want to thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. If anybody has a question, you can come up here and just grab a mic. And give us your name. We have about 15, 20 minutes. Give us your name, who you are.
Well, my name is Daniel Hernandez. I come from Oakland. I'm 19 years old.
A little louder, a little louder.
My name is Daniel Hernandez. I come from Oakland. I attend Laney College from the Peralta Community District. And I have a question for you. It's a hardball question. You mentioned the policy of, was it Common Core?
Yeah.
Can you please explain that?
I told you. Very few people know Common Core. Common Core is an attempt to create a higher quality of learning by raising the quality of instruction, the quality of the courses you take. For example, math. Too many schools teach very low-level math. Not enough kids are being asked to deal with more advanced math, algebra, calculus. So here, and the same applies for English, language, science, social studies. These are folks who say we have tolerated mediocrity, meaning low standards in what we teach and how we teach. It's time to raise it so we can compete with the rest of the world. Common Core, core meaning the core basic subjects, initially starting with reading and mathematics, but then extending to other subjects at some point. Common meaning everybody's going to be teaching the same stuff, or at least comparable to the same stuff. Every state decides. Then we get to, well, how are we going to know one way or the other if this is good or bad? Tests come down the pike. We begin to test kids. And the reason I said national curriculum is because if you ask states to follow pretty much the same script, well, that becomes a national curriculum. That's the Common Core as I understand it. There's a lot we don't know. It's barely been adopted. Next few years, we'll find out. Maybe you could hand that off to someone there.
Thank you, sir.
You bet. You're welcome.
I want to thank you for your presentation and for bringing the young people. I
Hey,
think that
you
was so
should
refreshing
thank
and
them.
wonderful. Yeah. So I'm Saroja Barnes. I currently work for the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. But before that, I taught high school social studies for 15 years in a very well-resourced school district in the state of Maryland. And one of the frustrations I had there, I know there's a lot of research and conversation about incorporating more technology, instructional technology, in the work that we do with this, these essentially digital natives, right? This generation that we're working with now. But in my experience working in Maryland and doing professional development with other teachers in my state, it was very disconcerting when I would try to work with teachers in school districts who just did not have access. They were still operating with dial-up in their communities because the lines just weren't there. I'm talking about areas on the eastern shore of our state and in other parts of the western part of the state. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, you know, how we advocate for more economic resources and infrastructure around that for our schools and for our young people.
Well, it's interesting you talk about Maryland, because Maryland is supposed to be on all the rankings, you know, if you take those seriously, first or second next to Massachusetts. As far as, you know, academic, educational ratings, the isolation of these communities is a business decision. It's not an educational decision. People don't have, I mean, still have dial-up because they don't have access to modern technology. And I'm not so sure that educators, I mean, they can advocate, but I'm not sure, they're not in a position to decide whether their school has internet or not. They really don't. It's amazing. It's ironic. Politicians have decisions, I mean, make decisions about business decisions, and certainly business. There's no easy answer to what you're saying, although I do think that less so. I mean, if you look, we did stories back 10 years ago when West Virginia became a big laboratory because of its reputation, certainly Appalachia, poor communities, isolated communities, poor communities that didn't have access to very much. And there was an attempt there to bring in technology big time. Well, you know, 10 years later, there are still huge pockets of West Virginia that don't have it. And you wonder, why not? Because it wasn't profitable. That was really the answer. It wasn't profitable. Does that mean that some really mean old people or young people sit around the table and say, here's who's going to have technology and who's not? Maybe not. But those decisions are made every day. I just think that the silver lining is that technology is going to overcome us anyway. It's getting to places later than it should, but it's going to be there. It's going to get there. The tragedy is that we've lost generations of kids who grow up without it, who don't benefit from it. But what else is new in American public education? Think about the 60s and the 50s and before. Another question over here. You could come over and grab the phone.
Thank you. My name is Charles Saunders from Columbus, Ohio. And you mentioned the term like-mindedness a little while ago. I'm just wondering if in the United States we have become so fragmented that we've lost the ability to creatively address problems such as the needs of public education. It just seems to me that we are going in so many different directions. We are such a diverse society, but we don't seem to honor that, and we don't seem to really know how to bring our diversity together to make it work.
And that's why I don't do too many stories out of Washington, because that's ground zero of what you just described. I think that the diversity of this nation is its true calling. This is a nation built on immigrants, and I don't need to tell you that. That said, we are going to reinvent what a nation should be, because we're not going to fall into ethnic wars and violence. We're going to create a common society. Has that disappeared? No. You know, it's tragic, but the one time that most people feel like they're all Americans in the same boat is when there's tragedy, when there is Sandy Hook, when there is the Boston Marathon bombing, when there is 9/11, when a shuttle blows up in the air. Tragedy brings us together, and what I've noticed is that the goodwill lasts less and less and less time. Think about Sandy Hook. Think about how quickly that deteriorated into a fight with an NRA and among policymakers, and how quickly it got politicized. It's amazing. That's not a good sign. But this country, I think, is nearing a point of exhaustion with this division and acrimony. I don't know what's going to tip us over to a point where this nation says, the hell with those arguments. We need to build a future for our children that makes sense. I don't know when that moment's going to come or who's going to say it, but there's going to come a time. If I didn't believe that, I'd move to Costa Rica and find a really nice beach and spend the rest of my time there. Yeah, let's do that. That's my wife talking. It would be. Thank you, Matt. That is a good question to ask you about where you see this country headed, knowing all that we know about how we fight. Any takers? Here's a mic. Because there's so much that divides us in this country, we fight about everything. What is it going to take to unite us in your lifetime when you've got kids, when you've got family? How do you feel about that?
So the only thing I can really think of in response to that question is creating something where we are accepting of each other's differences and where we can all sit down in a room and have a conversation with each other where it doesn't result to anger or violence or something like that, where we can just express our feelings and everybody's accepting, and then we come to some type of common conclusion as to how to address the issues that are going on in America.
That's it. But how do you make it happen?
That's a bigger question as well. How do you make it happen? I think it all starts with a certain type of mindset. If you get at least 2 or 3 people with a mindset that's willing to sit down and do that, maybe others will look on and see and say, okay, I'm ready to sit down. I'm ready to have this conversation with you as well. It takes time, but it's all in the mindset.
Malaysia.
To answer that question, I feel that if there's more exposure of what's going on and the more people can see and know about it, then the more people will want to change it. And that's my answer to that.
Is that right?
I'm going to kind of piggyback on what you said. Things need to be exposed. A lot of stuff is just kind of held back. Everybody knows what, kind of is going on. Maybe some people don't, but really maybe, have some young people sit down of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and talk about it and put it out there so everybody can see it. Like I said, a lot of people don't know that they're poor. Well, like in my sociology class, I'm learning about those numbers, and I learned that I am part of that number. So that stuff can be really touchy. But you got to deal with it. That's the only way I see it happening. You got to deal with it. It's touchy. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, but you have to. And I think that a lot of stuff in this country is held back, and maybe some for good reason, but that's the only way that I see it happening. Also, programs for young people, like the All-Stars, that brought a lot of different kids together from different backgrounds of different places, and we're learning to work together in the business environment. And that's really important. And it's, inner city youth, people from, places of poverty coming together, working with more matured people, the cool people. No, but honestly, that's what it's gonna take, and it takes people, young people from places where they don't have resources and things, coming together, and working with people of more knowledge, and like programs like that. Like I said, that's what we need to have.
Thank you. That was great. Oh yeah.
Also, like what you said, that it's when tragedy happens, when people come together. I think that if you highlight more of what happens that's good that young people do, then people can see that people are out there, young people are out there doing things to change, but it has to be shown.
Yeah. And one last thing I'll say, we're out of time, but you know what gets in the way with this notion of diversity is that when people feel threatened that whatever they have is going to be taken away because we're more diverse, we're waiting for an enormously important decision from the Supreme Court on affirmative action. And that thing is going to go down the tubes, by the way. That's my prediction. We're going to abandon this idea that race should be a factor. I see it coming. But guess what that has allowed people to pretty much believe is true? That because you're giving people who've never had an opportunity, that you are going to suffer for that. That is what has driven the rhetoric in higher education has been, yeah, we want to be diverse. But you know what? Every single college that I've been to talk about diversity and affirmative action have done it on the cheap. They have not put the resources into real diversity. It's diversity on the cheap. And maybe, just maybe, this decision to ban affirmative action from higher education is going to force colleges and universities to find other ways of creating that diverse community that we want.